Tēnā koutou, my name's Cy Taffel and I'm a Senior Lecturer in Media Studies at Massey University, Aotearoa, New Zealand. This paper's titled Data and Oil, Metaphor, Materiality and Metabolic Rifts. It's hard to escape hyperbolic claims that data is the new oil. This metaphor suggests that society is in the midst of a data revolution, and that this new paradigm centred on information and communication technology will be as transformative as the industrial revolutions were in the 19th and 20th centuries. Data is the new oil indicates an imagined shift from the dirty extractive industries of the past towards a smart, sustainable future where disembodied information floats weightlessly like the clouds that are used to describe today's planetary digital infrastructures. The reality, however, is that material practices like data and Bitcoin mining are dependent upon vast amounts of extraction. Digital infrastructure, which is typically designed to be unseen and unacknowledged, acts alongside the discursive framings of data as immaterial or liquid to mystify the entanglements between computational capitalism and the extractive industries, that is to say, the very real material relationships that exist between data and oil. As Nick Couldry and Ulysses Mejias have recently argued, whereas industrial capitalism was predicated on a colonial model of extractivism that exploited and profited from conquering new territories, resources and labour forces, today data colonialism proceeds by acquiring a new type of common resource from which value is extracted, data about life, and which is designed to predictively act upon life, especially human life. This presentation argues that focusing on the social and ecological impacts of platform capitalism and data colonialism requires us to connect questions surrounding digital extractivism to the emerging literatures surrounding metabolic rifts and degrowth, questioning the desirability of aspects of the data revolution. The dominant way in which the relationship between data and oil is currently conceptualized is through metaphor, such as the frequently heard claim that data is the new oil. While this certainly isn't the only metaphor that surrounds data, we also frequently hear about a data deluge, the data revolution, data tsunamis, and so on. The frequency with which a connection is drawn between data and oil is the beginning part of my analysis of the relationships that exist between data and oil. As Cornelius Puschmann and Jean Burgess outline, metaphor is an important conceptual tool that enables us to understand abstract concepts in terms of more familiar and concrete ones. In the case of data is the new oil, the connection suggests a new socio-economic paradigm where digital data becomes the key material fueling the global economy. The central message that computational systems have supplanted fossil fuels in driving social, cultural and economic logics isn't in fact new though. For example, in the Spanish sociologist Manuel Castell's trilogy of books on the information age that were released in the mid to late 1990s, the central argument was that since the introduction of the personal computer in the late 1970s, society was transitioning from an industrial to an informational society, where information was understood to be the raw material on which technology acted. Following the metaphor of data is the new oil, the Industrial Revolution is often understood to have been composed of several relatively distinct periods in which different fossil fuels were transformational. So coal was key to the expansion of railways and steamships in the 19th century, while oil later occupied a dominant role associated with automobiles, aircraft, and products like plastics in the 20th century. Homologously, where the introduction of the personal computer and networking protocols like the Internet Protocol version 4 in the early 1980s was associated with global supply chain logistics, just-in-time production and neoliberalism, today's digital landscape incorporating the Internet of Things, mobile computation and cloud computing is associated with moves towards platform capitalism and data colonialism, where according to Nick Cernicek, data is the raw material that allows platforms to flourish. I think we should be somewhat suspicious though of the discursive move away from information, which implies already processed, analysed or structured data, towards the idea of data as raw material, or worse still, raw data. As Jeff Boker and Lisa Gittelman have both argued, raw data is an oxymoron. Data doesn't simply exist out there in the world waiting to be collected or extracted, it's always something that needs to be actively produced or generated. The metaphorical connection between data and oil suggests that whereas crude oil requires fractional distillation before the raw material becomes useful, a similar process sees raw data aggregated, cleaned, and analysed to become information. This should, however, be understood as a mystification of the process of data collection, which is a purposive action whereby sensors deliberately extract and measure particular phenomena either directly or by proxy. This process is not the revelation of a pre-existing truth about the world, but following key insights from science and technology studies, the act of measuring is a relational encounter defined by the social and technological actors enrolled in the process of generating measurements. This sense of data production as a material encounter involving social and technological actors is one that leads me away from the metaphorical relationship that's imagined to exist between data and oil, and towards thinking about the material ties existing between data and oil. Before doing so, however, I wanted to highlight a dimension of the metaphor that isn't what gets suggested when The Economist and other right-wing outlets promote the idea that data is the new oil. Oil was a key driver of colonial conquest and geopolitical conflict across the 20th century. Even after formal colonisation ended, governments were overthrown for daring to suggest that oil might be nationalised, such as the 1953 Iranian coup that saw the US and UK remove a democratically elected prime minister and install the Shah as dictator. Perhaps we should think about reclaiming the metaphor of data as the new oil to draw parallels between the historical colonial extraction of geological wealth and data colonialism's extraction of contemporary wealth. In both cases, powerful and wealthy actors argue that only they have the means to extract and refine this material into a good that will allegedly benefit everyone, but which in fact primarily enriches economic elites and increases economic inequality. The multiple material connections between data and oil require elaboration, in part because of the commonplace misconception that there's a technological teleology that runs from primitive tools through dirty and polluting industrial machines to smart and sleek information technologies that depend on immaterial labour, produce virtual realities, and where knowledge lives in a cloud. Behind that obfuscatory discourse, however, lies a material reality whereby digital technologies and the data they produce are deeply entangled with dirty, toxic, and energy-intensive extractive industrial processes. At one level, between 15 and 25% of most microelectronics devices are literally made of oil in the form of plastics, with electronics using about 13 million tonnes of plastic every year. Plastics are used for numerous reasons. Their properties of being electrical and thermal insulators makes them a good choice for things like circuit boards. Their lightweight and capacity to be moulded while retaining strength makes them well suited for cast parts like casings and fans, and their elasticity is ideal for things like cable housings. Another form of material connection between data and oil exists within the production of devices and infrastructures that are required for digital capitalism to operate. Digital technologies are materially complex artifacts. They typically require between 60 and 70 of the 84 non-radioactive elements found on Earth. From tantalum capacitors to gold-plated pins, copper wires, silicon chips, and lithium-cobalt batteries, these materials are employed to leverage the unique affordances of those elements. Of course, procuring these materials requires globalized extraction industries, which, as many of the presentations in this conference outline, have a wide range of damaging impacts for people and planet, not least of which are the energy requirements associated with extracting those materials, which typically require significant volumes of fossil fuels, including oil. It should, however, be noted that what's extracted from the Earth isn't usually tantalum, indium, lithium, or lanthanum. As Nicole Starosielski astutely notes, the ores that are extracted are far removed from the highly purified materials that are required for high-performance, reliable microelectronics. For example, copper requires several stages of specialized treatment beyond the extraction of copper from waste rock, as even minor impurities significantly reduce its conductivity to a point where it wouldn't adequately function within contemporary digital assemblages. This includes being heated in numerous furnaces before a final stage of electrolytic refining removes the final trace elements of lead, nickel, zinc, gold, and silver, which leaves copper that is over 99.7% pure. Similarly, numerous rare earth elements play key roles in microelectronics, like the use of erbium in amplifying signals within fiber optic cables, and neodymium magnets that are found in headphones, microphones, and hard disk drives. Despite their collective name, rare earths aren't especially rare. However, they occur in low concentrations, entangled with one another and radioactive materials. Consequently, the process of extracting specific elements requires a huge amount of energy and produces a large volume of toxic waste. So, for example, the main tailing pond at Bayan Obo, China's largest rare earth processing facility, holds over 180 million tons of acidic and radioactive waste. When we think about the many forms of extraction that are required to produce digital technologies, it's perhaps unsurprising that despite only weighing about 150 grams, a top-of-the-line iPhone has a lifetime carbon footprint of around 110 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, while a top-end Mac Pro 2019 desktop has a carbon footprint of just under 7 tons. Of course, in order for the globalized network of extractive industries to move ores to refinery for purification, then onto various factories where they're manufactured into discrete components, and eventually to bring all those discrete components together to manufacture the phone itself, requires a huge amount of transportation, the vast majority of which is powered by oil. According to Edward Hume, the iPhone has a transportation footprint at least as great as a 240,000-mile trip to the moon and most or all of the way back. When considering the energy and fossil fuel demands of contemporary computing, though, it's important to not focus entirely on end-user devices, because this is only the tip of the technological iceberg that's required for platform capitalism to function. Data centers, 3, 4 and 5G cellular towers, all the sensors required for smart cities, GPS satellites, and the hundreds of millions of kilometers of fiber optic cable are just a few of the energy-intensive technologies that are required for data colonialism. Indeed, estimates are that by 2030, 21% of all global electricity will be for information and communication technologies. It turns out then that the data revolution is dependent upon vast quantities of oil and other fossil fuels for extracting ore from the planet, for purifying those materials, for manufacturing technologies, and for all the transportation associated with these assemblages of globally distributed materials. Far from being smart, green and weightless, the cloud turns out to be closer to a cloud of toxic smog. The material relationship between data and oil isn't one-way traffic, though. Just as a huge amount of oil is required for data colonialism, today digital data and sensing techniques are necessary for locating oil and other fossil fuels, as large and easily accessible reserves has largely been depleted. Techniques including seismic reflection imaging and thermal sensing are employed to visualize oil reservoirs at depths of up to 3,000 meters, with this process of making the invisible seen being the first step in unearthing new sources of oil. Throughout the procurement process, fossil fuel companies today promote their use of data-driven technologies, including artificial intelligence, advanced analytics and robotics to improve yields, boost the rates of production, and maintain safety. Viewed this way, we can see the merit of Castell's discussion of the informationalization of industry. Just as the Industrial Revolution industrialized agricultural processes, today digital technologies have informationalized industry. Informed by the material connections between data and oil, I want to conclude this presentation thinking about metabolic rifts and degrowth in relation to digital technology. Karl Marx initially wrote about capitalism and metabolic rifts in the context of capitalism robbing both the worker and the soil, therefore simultaneously undermining the original sources of all wealth. In the contemporary context of numerous ecological crises that are problematically referred to as the Anthropocene, the metabolic rift sees a global system that's undermining the future by robbing the planetary commons and burning its geological heritage. Past life becomes today's fuel, which poisons the future. With regards to oil, it's absolutely clear that to avoid ecological and social disaster, it's paramount that we keep it in the ground. There are clear limits to the amount of oil that we can burn before we breach multiple planetary boundaries, especially when we factor in unconventional sources of oil like that's produced from tar sands and fracking. Consequently, the emerging degrowth movement has sought to outline how societies can flourish without being predicated on the fantasy of unlimited economic growth on a finite planet, which is currently coupled with gross material inequalities both between and within nation states. Relatively little has been said thus far, however, on what thinking about metabolic rifts and degrowth might mean for digital technologies. Once we accept that data doesn't simply exist out there waiting to be captured, but is something that has to be actively produced through materially intensive extractive processes, the rhetoric of ongoing exponential increases in data collection to fuel surveillance-driven modes of platform capitalism is revealed to be little more than the latest colonial capitalist fantasy. Some of the most obviously perverse digital behaviour can be seen in something like Bitcoin mining, a process that currently uses a similar amount of electricity as Algeria, a country whose population is over 40 million. The immense amount of energy used here produces nothing in terms of use value. It merely creates value based on the exchange value rate of Bitcoin. Put simply, in an ecologically sane society, Bitcoin does not and should not exist. Equally though, we must question the economic model that underpins advertising platforms like Google and Facebook, one based on utilising vast amounts of data allied with machine learning algorithms to target users with adverts. On a planet where resources are already being consumed far faster than they're replenished while billions still live in poverty, a highly sophisticated technological system designed to manufacture desire for increased levels of consumption can only really be understood as a fundamentally suicidal and self-defeating logic, one that seeks to extract as much profit as possible with no regard for the ecological and social calamity that this causes. This doesn't mean I'm suggesting an end to all data collection. There are huge numbers of socially and ecologically beneficial projects that rely upon data extraction and analysis, from climate change modelling to analysing urban air pollution to monitoring traffic to ease congestion. But in each of those cases, data extraction and analysis serves a useful purpose. They contribute to a common good rather than simply consuming resources to enrich already wealthy humans. Just as we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground, we need to abandon the fantasy that data extraction is a weightless endeavour that can grow infinitely. This means having public debate and national and international regulations that prevent the proliferation of modes of data extraction that serve no useful purpose, while at the same time requiring the unsustainable consumption of planetary resources.